As the global population exceeds sustainable numbers, every resource is becoming increasingly scarce. The primary needs of any human being are food, water, and shelter. And unfortunately, all three are the most sought after and fiercely competed. Now we are not here to talk about food and water, but shelter is something that seems like a solvable issue, right? Well, if we develop cities smartly, we can probably pull it off. Right now, cities like Vienna have an excellent solution to housing problems that its citizens face. However, in the US, the most powerful country in the world, housing seems to be a major issue. Of course, it varies from city to city, but it seems like Chicago is having the worst of it. In today's video, we will look into how Chicago can potentially use Vienna's affordable housing model to solve its own housing problems. Before we get into the details, let me remind you why Chicago is significant. For starters, Chicago is the third most populated city in the United States and has one of the highest growth rates in urban population. The urbanization problem is not going to go away, since as urban economies flourish, it is predicted that we see over 60% of the global population concentrated in the world's major cities. With Chicago also subsequently holding third place in terms of GDP among US cities, it has an exceptionally thriving economy. The city's GDP is over $0.69 trillion. The sheer amount of economic activity that occurs in this hustling and bustling metropolis means that it is a very attractive destination for many US citizens that reside in smaller communities. However, this also means that there is a consistent challenge that the city's authorities face, managing such large populations. There is an acute problem in terms of housing in the city. As more and more people flow in, the city simply does not have the capacity to house everyone, and even the rate of growth that housing projects have to offer simply does not keep up with the influx. The simple market rule for demand and supply comes into place here at this point, which means that since more people want homes, the costs are extraordinary. The average low-income Chicago household spends more than half of its income on rent. That is a terrifying fact, if you ask me, because it means a lot of people who are already financially disadvantaged are exposed to further regression, even at the risk of homelessness. Of course, this problem had long existed as soon as commercial activities in the city rivaled those of other major cities, such as New York. However, there has been a sharp increase in the city's housing problems due to the coronavirus pandemic. As the virus caused major downsizing in most firms, joblessness rose, and with housing costs as high as they already were, people simply could not afford to have a roof over their heads. If you have been to Chicago, you know that it is a tough and competitive city. Even the weather in Chicago can be a bit challenging at most times, and any construction projects that take place are often concentrated in the summertime when the weather favors such work. But before we depress ourselves further, let us look at what can be done. As mentioned at the start of the video, Vienna has come up with an ingenious solution to its own housing problems. Vienna is currently working on developing one of Europe's largest new urban development projects. It is only a part of Vienna's overall program to strategically provide affordable housing to its citizens, Aspern-Seestadt. This takes community living to the next level. Vienna has already had affordable housing as a major part of its urban infrastructure. In fact, over 62% of Vienna's population lives in some part of an affordable housing project. This includes a number of public housing blocks. A major factor that contributes to the affordability of these residences owes to them being subsidized by the council administration that governs the city. This means that citizens are incentivized to buy their own houses or apartments, which are cheap and on easy terms because their facilitators are not banks or financial enterprises, but the government itself. Now, that might not fit perfectly into the capitalist market practices that are dominant in the US. However, they are certainly working better to solve a number of problems. Besides, areas that provide citizens with intrinsic basics should not be that heavily monetized either. The development of affordable housing projects in Vienna has been ongoing since the 1920s, so there is a system that is well in place. Of course, since then, many parts of the US have had their fair share of public housing projects, but given how they were not pursued wholeheartedly meant that they became sources of discrimination, making them highly unattractive. The situation was particularly bad in places like Chicago, where the overall city life generally demands toughness. But again, to translate Vienna's model onto Chicago, we need to realize the root problem that differentiates the same level of housing projects' success. With Chicago, as with other major US cities, that problem arises due to exclusive zoning problems. Along with many major urban centres, suburban development focuses on providing large single-family residences that take up an abnormal amount of space. Of course, only the financially well-off can afford these, and public housing projects thus become a form of segregation for the financially disadvantaged. To say that we need to explicitly abolish separate housing units completely for those that can afford it is not the best solution. So again, let's look to Vienna. In Vienna, tall, cold apartment buildings were not what prevented a serious housing crisis. It was simply the standard of these public housing buildings, as well as their deliberately reduced capacity. In projects such as Seestadt, Vienna offers smaller multi-family housing units to its citizens. These can be described as small apartment buildings which resemble the outlook of suburban houses and feature communal facilities. Whereas every family get their own fair share of privacy, the occupants use things like communal workspaces or conjoined kitchens. The environment becomes friendlier and gives everyone a more exclusive feel, as these smaller units are much more personalised and easily maintained compared to large apartment buildings. That simply adds to their appeal, allowing the government to continue furthering similar projects. But of course, how much of this can be done on a government budget? Well, Vienna adopted a solution to that as well. Instead of bearing the entire cost of these housing projects, most of them were awarded on subsidised rates to private developers. So with an entire market dedicated to creating affordable housing, it became an industry of its own. At this point, it seems like something that is more in line with the US government's spending patterns, right? That is exactly why, despite the drastic situation, there is still hope, since it appeals to all parties. Further, by offering subsidised renting to the occupants, the government also allows them more freedom to choose, making the private developers compete to put better and better facilities in their housing projects. This also contributes to driving down construction costs, as more developers are willing to drive costs down to be more appealing to both the government and the citizens, owing again to the principle of supply and demand that I mentioned earlier. Of course, this model can be used in almost every major US city. The reasons why it should be copied are plentiful and well understandable by what has been said so far. But if we are to be more particular to the case of Chicago, there are a number of reasons why Chicago should take the lead in adopting the Viennese model. For starters, Chicago is one of the most populated cities and has one of the most expensive housing costs in the country. But particular to the case of Chicago is how easily applicable it is. Primarily due to the city's restricted construction window. This is among the shortest in the major cities, which means construction firms would be more than interested in taking up these subsidised projects. With sufficient demand, equally high willingness to supply, and an acute housing problem to be solved, Chicago desperately needs to develop its own version of Vienna's affordable housing model. Well, that is about it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, leave a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more. Until next time.